On January 26th, Iran released a video that got the attention of military analysts all over the world. The footage showed a swarm of drones attacking a target that looked exactly like an American aircraft carrier. The message behind the video was clear and simple. They were saying, "We can see your carriers, we can reach them, and when the time comes, our drones will overwhelm your defenses." It looked convincing. Cheap drones flying in large numbers, attacking from multiple directions, overwhelming expensive American warships. On paper, the strategy actually made sense. Drones that cost a few $1,000s forcing the United States Navy to fire missiles that cost millions. If you repeat that enough times, eventually the ships run out of missiles. And once the missiles are gone, the carrier becomes a floating target. At least that was the theory. But what Iran didn't know was that the Navy had been quietly working on a new weapon, a weapon that doesn't fire missiles, doesn't fire bullets, and doesn't even make a sound. A weapon that could potentially make drone swarms almost useless. And if a real attack like the one in that video ever happened, the result would probably look very different from what Iran expected. So let's imagine what would actually happen if a drone swarm was launched toward a U.S. carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf. It would start early in the morning just after sunrise. Around 0600 local time, radar operators on the Iranian coast begin launching drones from several coastal sites. One by one, small aircraft lift off and turn south toward the Strait of Hormuz. Their target is a U.S. carrier strike group centered around a nuclear aircraft carrier and several destroyers. These aren't advanced stealth drones or high-tech aircraft. These are Shahed 136 drones, simple one-way attack drones designed to fly to a set of GPS coordinates and crash into whatever is there. Soldiers in Ukraine actually gave them a nickname, mopeds, because of the loud buzzing sound their small engines make as they fly overhead. Once launched, these drones don't communicate with operators, they don't receive new instructions, and they don't avoid threats. They simply follow pre-programmed GPS coordinates until they either hit the target or run out of fuel and crash. There's no radar warning receiver, no defensive system, no ability to change course. In simple terms, they're basically flying bombs with a GPS chip inside. But long before these drones ever get close to a U.S. carrier, someone else is already watching them. High above the strike group, at around 25,000 feet, an E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft is circling in a wide orbit. From that altitude, its radar can see hundreds of kilometers in every direction, and the moment those drones lifted off the Iranian coast, they appeared on the radar screen as small moving contacts over the water. To the radar system on that aircraft, tracking those drones is not difficult at all. In fact, detecting them is almost trivial. The radar can track thousands of objects at the same time, and even small drones show up clearly when they're flying in open sky with nothing around them. Within seconds, every ship in the carrier strike group receives the same targeting data. This is because of something called cooperative engagement capability, a network that connects all ships and aircraft together so they share one giant radar picture. It means one aircraft can detect a target, and a destroyer many kilometers away can fire at that target without even seeing it with its own radar. So while the drones are still far away, the entire strike group already knows exactly how many there are, where they are, how fast they're flying, and when they will arrive. And that's when the situation becomes interesting, because instead of immediately shooting everything down with missiles, the commander of the strike group decides to do something unexpected. The commander knew the drones were not alone. About 12,000 feet above the water, far to the east of the strike group, an Iranian surveillance drone was already in the air. It wasn't carrying weapons, it was just watching, recording, and transmitting video back to a command center on the Iranian coast. Everything that happened next would be seen in real time, and the commander knew that. He could have destroyed that surveillance drone immediately with a single missile. One launch, one hit, and Iran would be blind. But he didn't do it. Instead, he allowed it to stay in the air and watch everything. Because sometimes in warfare, what the enemy learns is more important than what they lose. As the first wave of drones continued flying toward the strike group, the ships began preparing their defenses. On one of the destroyers, the main 5-inch naval gun slowly rotated and locked onto the first incoming targets. This gun fires special proximity-fused shells that explode near the target and spray thousands of metal fragments through the air. When the first drones came within range, the gun fired 3 times, 3 explosions in the sky. 3 drones disappeared instantly, torn apart by shrapnel. The remaining drones kept coming, flying straight and level, unable to react, unable to dodge, unable to change course. They were programmed to fly forward, and that's exactly what they did, even as they were being shot down one by one. Then the next defensive system activated, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-guided rotary cannon mounted on the deck, spun up with a loud mechanical whine that every sailor recognizes instantly. When this system fires, it releases thousands of rounds per minute, creating a wall of metal in the air. Within seconds, several more drones were shredded into debris that fell into the water below. Now only a few drones remained, and this time the destroyer launched rolling airframe missiles. These missiles use infrared guidance to chase targets and destroy them in midair. 1 missile per drone, 1 explosion per target. Less than 2 minutes after the first shot was fired, all the drones were gone. 12 drones destroyed. 0 damage to the strike group. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was that the Iranian surveillance drone had watched everything. It saw the guns firing. It saw the missiles launching. It saw how many weapons were used and how long the engagement took. And from that information, Iranian planners could calculate something very important. They could calculate how many missiles the ships carried, how many drones it took to force missile launches, and how quickly the ships would run out of interceptors. In other words, they were learning the math of the battle, and that math was the foundation of their entire strategy. Their plan was never to destroy the carrier with the first wave. The plan was to force the ships to waste expensive missiles on cheap drones until the magazines were empty. Then the real attack would begin. And that is exactly why the commander allowed the surveillance drone to keep watching. He wanted them to believe their plan was working. He wanted them to send more drones. And about an hour later, that's exactly what they did. Because the next wave was not 12 drones, it was more than 70.
About an hour after the first drones were destroyed, radar operators on the Hawkeye aircraft noticed something new. Not just 1 or 2 contacts lifting off from the Iranian coast, but dozens at the same time. Then more, and more. Within minutes, the radar screen was filled with new tracks moving south over the water toward the carrier strike group. The operators began counting them, and the number kept rising. 40 from one direction, 30 from another, and several more flying low along the coastline, barely above the surface of the water. This wasn't a test anymore. This was the real swarm. Iran's strategy was actually very simple. They knew American ships carried a limited number of interceptor missiles. Even the most heavily armed destroyers only have a certain number of vertical launch cells, and not all of them are loaded with air defense missiles. Some carry Tomahawk cruise missiles, some carry anti-submarine rockets, and some are reserved for ballistic missile defense. So even though a destroyer might carry close to 100 missiles in total, the number available for shooting down drones and aircraft is much lower. And each interceptor missile costs millions of dollars. The drones, on the other hand, are cheap, extremely cheap compared to missiles. That means if you launch enough drones, you can force the enemy to spend huge amounts of money and eventually run out of interceptors completely. Once that happens, the ships have nothing left to stop the next wave. This strategy is called saturation attack. You don't try to make one weapon powerful, you make many weapons cheap, and you overwhelm the defense system with numbers. As the swarm continued moving closer, the ships in the strike group began calculating the interception plan. Missile officers were already doing the math. If they used missiles to shoot down every drone, they would spend tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars in a single engagement. And worse, they might run out of interceptors before the attack was over. And the Iranians knew this. In fact, this entire attack was designed around that exact calculation. The first wave forces the ships to react. The second wave forces them to fire missiles. The third wave arrives when the ships are running low on interceptors. Eventually, something gets through. From the Iranian perspective, everything was going exactly according to plan. But on the American ships, something strange happened. Even though dozens of drones were approaching, the vertical launch missile cells remained closed. No missiles were launched, no interceptors fired. The ships were tracking every drone, but they weren't engaging them with their main weapons. Some of the sailors in the Combat Information Center were confused. Normally, this would be the moment when missiles start launching one after another. But the commander gave a different order. He ordered the ships to hold their missiles and prepare a different system. A system that most of the crew had never seen used in real combat before. On the deck of one of the destroyers, between the missile launch cells and the bridge, there was a flat panel array mounted to the ship. It didn't look like a gun. It didn't look like a missile launcher. It looked like just another antenna or radar panel, something most people would ignore if they saw it in a photo. But that flat panel was not a radar. It was not a communications system. It was a weapon. A weapon that had been under development for years, tested in secret, and quietly installed on a small number of ships without much public attention. Many intelligence analysts who saw satellite images of it thought it was just a new communications upgrade. They were wrong. And in the next few minutes, that mistake was about to become very obvious. Because the Navy was about to use a weapon that doesn't shoot bullets, doesn't fire missiles, and doesn't even make a sound. As the swarm of drones continued closing in,